Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about that same comic book graphic novel or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week, once again, for the second week in a row, we're talking about World's Finest in our World's Finest team up. But this time we're talking about the original World's Finest. This is the World's Finest Silver Age Volume 1 trade paperback. Unfortunately, I did not buy the omnibus when it came out. I thought I had a little bit more time to get it, but it sold out. And now it's way expensive, so I had to get this trade paperback instead. Oh well. It's awesome. This is a great trade paperback, and the reproduction in this volume is fantastic. These comics just look great in this volume, so they did a really nice job, I have to say, DC Comics did with this volume. But let's talk about World's Finest. So, World's Finest, this comic book was originally a comic book that did have Superman and Batman in it, only they did not have adventures together to start off with. They had separate adventures in this comic. But in the Superman comic, in Superman number 76, Superman and Batman, for the first time ever, have an adventure together. So they meet up in this issue of Superman. Now, it turns out they retconned this not too long afterwards. But this is the adventure where they did find out each other's secret identities. So they're on board ship and they have to share a cabin, Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent do, because stuff just shakes out that way. And wouldn't you know it, an emergency happens and they end up discovering each other's secret identities in a way that would only happen in the Silver Age of comics. And then following that, they finally, in World's Finest, issue number 71, they actually do have an adventure together for the first time in World's Finest comics. It's very surprising that it took them so long to figure out, hey, it would be awesome if these two popular characters were to actually be in stories together. Seems like a natural idea, but it took them forever to do it. But once they did it, it was a hit, and it was a great comic book. One of the best things that came out of the Silver Age, in my opinion. It was interesting to read these stories. I love this stuff, and I love these stories. It does make me, however, and I'll get into this in a bit, it makes me appreciate Stan Lee and what Stan Lee eventually did with comics, which I think was a necessary thing. This sort of points out, I think, why it was. And I'll talk about that in a second. Now, this takes place, these stories were published, I should say, in the early days of the Silver Age. So it's the early 50s. That initial Superman-Batman story that happened in Superman, that was from 1952. And then the rest of the stories go from 1954 through 1958. So it's early days in the Silver Age of comics in the 1950s. So the Golden Age hasn't been left far behind. There's this weird period between the Golden Age and the Silver Age in the early to mid 50s. Who knows how they would classify that? Who knows when one age actually stopped and another age actually began? Is there a hard line in the sand somewhere? I don't know. Some people don't really think that the Silver Age actually happened until the Flash burst onto the scene, the newer version of the Flash for DC Comics, the one we are more familiar with. When the Flash showed up on the scene, he kind of brought in with him the Silver Age of comics. Superman, his stories, there are Silver Age stories that are considered Silver Age before that, but like I said, it's a little bit nebulous. But nevertheless, this is considered Silver Age in this volume at least. And they do have that feel where virtually anything could happen in these comic books. These early 50s stories do have a different feeling to them than the stories that were happening at DC Comics in the 1960s. There is a different feel there. When this series began, the whole scandal that brought in the Comics Code Authority hadn't happened yet. Once it did, the Comics Code Authority and that whole fear that began in the early 50s where comic books were scapegoated for all kinds of juvenile delinquency. The Comics Code Authority came in, which was a self-censoring measure brought in by the comic book companies that was basically brought in, well, in a big part to kill off EC Comics. EC, Entertaining Comics, was the comic company that was making the best comic books. EC made the best comic books. The Comics Code Authority pretty much wiped them out because it was so restrictive. And those restrictions brought in by the Comics Code Authority kind of cemented some of the restrictions that DC Comics was already working under. And it kept those restrictions going for years. And so if you were a writer for DC Comics, you had to really use your imagination to come up with stories, because there were just so many restrictions as far as what you could and couldn't put in a comic book. And so a lot of these Silver Age DC comics had kind of a fairy tale kind of feel to them, in which virtually anything could happen. And I noticed in some of the stories, well, in most of the stories, some of the solutions to the problems that Batman and Superman and Robin face, Robin is in this as well, some of the problems that they face, their solutions are just ridiculous frequently. I mean, you could very often say, well, wouldn't it be easier just to... That seems like a crazy solution to this problem, but, you know, it happened anyway. Because, first of all, they felt like to come up with the solutions to the problems presented to these characters, you had to have Superman using his super strength or superpowers in amazing ways, and you had to have Batman using his keen detective abilities in amazing ways, or interesting ways. And also, they had to come up with creative ways to work around the Comic Book Code Authority. Now, the writer for most of these was Edmund Hamilton. There were a couple other writers that worked on the stories in this volume. We had Bill Finger did a few, and Alvin Schwartz was in there as well. The artist in the earlier issues was Curt Swan, who was an amazing Superman artist and worked on Superman for decades. He worked into the 1980s, Curt Swan did. And he left the book when John Byrne came on board and revamped everything. So Curt Swan was there through the entire Silver Age of comics with with Superman. And he draws the early issues of World's Finest here with Superman and Batman. It's not too long from here, though, after Curt Swan, that Dick Sprang actually starts taking over the art chores. And Dick Sprang, in a way, might be even more impressive on this book than Curt Swan was. Dick Sprang is just incredible on this book, and his artwork is just fantastic. So much great artwork in this book from Sprang. Let me see if I can get a good example of it. See, now that I'm looking for a particular story, I won't be able to find it. Here it is. The particular story I had in mind that can really showcase this is The Three Super Musketeers. Yeah, this is indeed a World's Finest story that could only happen in the Silver Age, probably, where to find out the secret identity of the man in the Iron Mask, Superman, Batman, and Robin go back in time. It's easy to go back in time in the Silver Age. You just have to find a scientist that has a ray that'll put you back in time. And wouldn't you know it, There is such a scientist. So back in time they go, where they meet the three Musketeers and D'Artagnan and become the three Super Musketeers. But the thing that really stands out with this artwork, aside from the fact that it's just so clean and so bold and so well presented, is just some of the wonderful work that Sprang does. I mean, look at that castle. Some of the backgrounds in this. I mean, he does not skimp on the backgrounds, Dick Sprang. So he has a lot of detail in the artwork. And he must have used a lot of reference material for this. I mean, look at that scene where you have a street in Paris. He just does amazing work in this. Now, it is highly stylized, but it works just so wonderfully. And visually, these stories are just a treat. And they are fun to read. But like I said, it does make me appreciate what Stan Lee did. Because I was thinking, what if superhero stories were always like this? Now, my partner in superheroics, Steve Donoghue, who does this with me once a week, very much laments the loss of this kind of story, which I can understand. But he lays all the blame at Stan Lee's feet and often refers to it as the Stanley Virus, how Stan Lee's ideas infected all of comic bookdom. And they did, in a way, because they were so popular and everybody loved them. And they sold, frankly, better than DC. Now, DC Comics on its own was changing a bit. The stories that you will read in the mid-60s, or the early 60s even, are different. They feel different from the stories that you'll read here from the early 50s to the mid-50s. They do have a slightly different feel to them. They're not quite so over-the-top ridiculous, although there was a lot of that still going on, a lot of it. But what Stan Lee did, when he came up with his own superheroes that had more distinct personalities than the superheroes you'd find in a Silver Age DC comic book. He came up with real life consequences, at least compared to DC Comics. They were more realistic compared to DC Comics. And I think that was a necessary change because the audience for comic books were growing up. And I think for comic books to survive, they did had to mature a little bit. Now, comic books were not always like this. Like I said, EC Comics were pretty mature comic books, which told some mature stories, particularly in shock suspense stories and comic books like that, which got them in trouble, unfortunately. But this stuff really feels like it's totally aimed to kids. Totally aimed at kids, which is fine. But comic books are a medium that can tell any kind of story. And so I appreciate what Stan Lee came in and did, because if this was all that there ever was, if this type of comic book story and the type of stories that actually continued into the 60s with DC, if that was the only kind of comic book stories that there were that were available, that's pretty limiting. As much as I love them, and I do, I love Silver Age DC. I love it. But they're easier to love because there are other types of comic book stories, thanks to Stan Lee. Now, what happened, unfortunately, is because Marvel Comics sold so well, DC Comics felt like it had to totally become their own version of Marvel Comics, which they sort of did. And in doing so, they lost some of the stuff that made them great. Because a lot of the stuff, particularly with the characters themselves, I mean, it was great. DC Comics and Marvel Comics, I think, should be two different things. They're two different kinds of comics. At least I think they should have stayed that way to a certain extent. But DC felt like they had to compete. And so they changed. and changed and changed. And eventually you got Crisis on Infinite Earths, which totally changed everything, including wiping out all of this stuff from continuity, which stings a little bit less now since they're wiping out their continuity all the time. DC Comics is. Nevertheless, I highly recommend this book. It's not just a fun read, it's also a piece of comic book history. It's just such a wonderful example of this specific time in comic books. And some of these stories are just incredibly inventive and fun. I do love DC in the Silver Age. Fortunately, DC Comics finally listened to me, and they are coming out with a Superman Silver Age omnibus in December, which is thrilling. I can't wait for that. That's been my most requested comic ever. Now, if only they'd come out with a Sergeant Rock omnibus and a Silver Age Hawkman omnibus, then I'd be a happy guy. But, I'll take that Superman omnibus. Hopefully it actually will show up. You never know with DC. But this is available now, and it's an awful lot of fun, so I highly recommend it. I guess that's all I have to say today for Epic Comic Book Wednesday. You have anything to say, Roger? Roger, he's not a huge fan of the Silver Age. He likes those Marvel horror comics from the 1970s. I agree with you there too, Roger. Those are awesome. Okay, guys, we'll catch you next time.